Right, hello everyone. I think we can start first. So thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Anna and I'm the Operations and Marketing Executive at CoSpace Park. So CoSpace Park is a co-working office that also provides event space for rental. We actually offer bi-weekly free events during this period. We have been hosting a lot of online talks, and our event topic ranges from health and wellness to personal development and more. So do support us by liking our social media pages for more information on upcoming events. And today we're presenting Food, Sustainable Diets and Environmental Impacts by Rish. So Rish is the founder of Trynkle, as some of us have known, and he has experience of finance, government, advisory, and fintech industries. And throughout his career, he has worked with many geographies and managed teams of more than 500 people. In addition, he also counsels multiple fintech startups in Southeast Asia. So we are sure excited for more insights from him this afternoon. And if there's any questions, even during the presentation, you feel free to send them into the chat box anytime. There will be allocated time for Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So now without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Rish. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Welcome everyone. Hope everyone's having a good day. Let me just share my screen. Just bear with me. Okay, so today's topic is really interesting. I have to say it's really interesting, but I genuinely mean it. I think it's a topic that's getting a lot of traction in the news at the moment, and it specifically deals with our view on food and how we are going to look at the future of food and how the world is essentially changing how we look at the future of food. Now, I kind of guess on my day-to-day basis, I kind of deal with food in kind of three different ways. I eat food, obviously, to sustain my life and because I enjoy eating food. But then one part of my job is actually also advising a few companies who are in the kind of green circular economy space and understanding how they're doing their best to improve the food culture and the level of understanding of food in society, and especially from a sustainability perspective. And the third kind of avenue of food is more of a kind of psychological aspect of food, where people are constantly having battles with their, with food and their mental health and association of food within their mental health. And, how do they go from, overeating to undereating? How is food a dependency within their regime? And I think probably later on with CoSpace Park, we're going to do a session that specifically deals with the psychology behind food. But today's is very much dealing with sustainability and how, from an environmental point of view, we should be kind of a bit more concerned about food. And it's going to be very much done in a non kind of preachy sense, very much done in a more of a factual sense. I'm going to present to you a lot of statistics about, why this topic is coming up now versus say 20, 30 years ago, and why it definitely needs to be included in our thought processes. And for those of you who are in the audience running your own businesses and potentially kind of looking at how your businesses can have corporate social responsibility kind of strategies and more sustainability strategies, it's definitely worth listening to, because I think there's ways, even if you're running a tech business, you can look at food sustainability and how you can help that arena, etc. So I think there's different aspects to it. We're definitely going to look at it from environmental and security aspects, and hopefully you guys enjoy it. So just a bit more about what I said earlier in terms of startups, and I'm currently talking to a lot of startups, especially in Singapore, which is kind of leading one of the drives in kind of plant-based food. I'm kind of advising them on their strategies and their setups, and there's always a bit of a mismatch because people associate kind of green and circular economy type startups as those startups that don't necessarily make a lot of money, but do a lot of social good and impact, right? And that's not necessarily the case. I don't think there's any real correlation there. But advising these startups made me aware of kind of a wider crisis that's going on in food. And specifically for those of us who kind of grew up and are kind of living in Western and developed countries, we don't necessarily think of food or we stereotype our thoughts of food in a global context. So if I were to tell you that, say 30, 40% of Africa doesn't have, enough food to sustain their life, that might sound like a big comment to you and maybe true, but it's not something we think about on a day-to-day basis. And maybe we don't need to think about it on a day-to-day basis, but we need to think about it on a longevity basis. And for those of you who listened to my talk on existential risk last week, you'll know that preparing for the future is kind of a moral obligation of the current generation, but it's also something that just automatically should flow through us because we're worried about our descendants and worried about how the future of the planet looks like. So think about it from these different contexts. And when you guys ask questions later, then by all means I'll help you do that. And the other thing, just from relating my career to food, I've worked at a lot of companies, especially on the investment banking side, who spent a lot of money on corporate social responsibility strategies. And a lot of them recently have done a lot of private investment into food tech, green tech, eco tech. And this is quite important because I think we're on a kind of precipice where we're kind of probably going to be moving away from your traditional techs where, fintechs and things like that, and possibly going to see a lot more entrance into kind of the green tech, food tech, sustainability tech space. And I think that's really interesting for those of you who are investors or those of you who are looking at potential careers in the future. I think that's something you can definitely look into. And I think it's going to be a big thing in at least the next 10 to 25 years. So, the first slide's quite interesting because this is how we think of food on a day-to-day basis. It's about what do we eat, who are we eating with, where are we getting our food from, is it tasty, is it cheap, or is it expensive? And that kind of is pretty all-encompassing with regards to how we think about food. You've got things like KFC, who are big food names, like McDonald's, who dominate the food market and really kind of dictate how we think about things, especially fast food in this case, but food generally. You've got street food. So those of you in Asia probably know a lot about this. Our world is encapsulated by, the hawker stores and kind of street markets we go to, maybe not now during COVID, but generally, and that dictates our food. When we think about ice cream, it's the same thing. Big pile of pancakes, very American type thing. And the whole point of this slide was to kind of give you an impression of how food is kind of positioned in our head. And it's very much, whether you're a person who eats to live or a person that lives to eat, your worldview of food is very much linear, and it's kind of looked at in that very closed corridor. You don't necessarily think about where the food has come from. You definitely don't think too much about where the food is going if you don't finish it. You don't necessarily think about the produce as much as you should. You don't necessarily think about the amount of resources that have gone into making that particular amount of food. And I think these are the things that I think are important for people to transition your view. And like I said at the beginning, it's not necessarily because we want all of you to become kind of eco-green warriors. It's more because we want you to just understand processes. And the better word is actually systems that encapsulate your food's process. And when you start to understand systems, you actually become a slightly more logical, coherent thinker. And whether you apply this to your own business, which can be about anything consumable, anything tech, anything finance, or whether you apply it to food, the logic pattern and the logic process is the same. And when you have your own business, you start to think, well, how do I make my business sustainable and long term? And the way to do that is to understand the value chain, to understand the proposition that you're doing. And it's very much the same when you're thinking about the sustainability of food. And the reason for me that it's really, really important now is it's not just about food. It's a bigger argument that we need to think about. So, we all know that the population of the world is growing. So, okay, that's important, great. It's growing, but by the year 2050, we could be close to about 10 billion people. But why does that matter? Well, it matters because do we have enough food to feed that 10 million people, or to 10 billion people, sorry, by 2050? And by current estimates, the answer is probably no. Okay. And then you start to look at this picture slightly differently. Well, okay, that means in 2050, what are we going to do with the people who don't have food? I mean, maybe we need to start thinking about those answers. Another interesting statistic, 45% of food produced is actually wasted, right? So that means literally nearly half the food that is in production at the moment at some stage will be wasted. Some of it is wasted from the consumer side. So, we just don't finish our meals and it goes missing. Some of it is very much wasted from the production side. So, things that don't make the grade, things that just go into trash. And even more interesting statistic to build your picture of food is, well, a third of all landfill, so a third of all those big piles of rubbish that you guys see, which are, causing CO2 emissions and causing huge landfill issues, a third of that is actually food. It's not plastics. It's not other materials, other used materials. It's food. So imagine that you've got that big pile of landfill, and a third of that is food that we're essentially wasting. And these are some of the picture. This is some of the examples I want to give you to help you kind of fill that picture. Another good example is consumption behavior has changed, right? So what we ate 50 years ago is changing. it's changed in 20 years, it's going to change in the next 20 years. You know, we're eating different types of foods, we're eating more processed food, we're eating different types of fruits because we can make more types of fruits, we're eating different types of plant-based meat. The whole consumption behavior has changed. And as a result, has our food production life cycle changed to accommodate that? So that's another thing you need to think about. And that's a really interesting point, which we'll get to later. And I guess the kind of lingering theme that comes over everything is more about kind of climate change. So how is all of this food production, distribution, packaging, all of this actually impacting our environment? Is it exacerbating climate change? Yes. And so therefore you need to interlink these kind of symbiotic factors. And I think it's really important. So this slide is just to show you that everything is not about food. It's not just necessarily about what goes in your mouth. It's about how that's produced and distributed and consumed. It's about how far that food has traveled. What does that actually mean? It means, well, did everything you eat today originate in your locale, in the local area surrounding you? Or did it come from the US? Or did it come from China? Or did it come from Australia? And obviously the miles that it's taken to come to you has impacted the packaging, the consumption, which in turn has impacted the environment. Resource usage. How much of our natural resources are being used to create the food that we eat on a daily basis? Good example of this is any of you who drink a cup of coffee, which is probably most of you. How many liters of water do you think it takes to make a cup of coffee, to produce that coffee and that drink? When I ask people this, usually they'll say, you know, okay, maybe half a liter, bit of wastage here, maybe 1 liter. Okay. It actually takes 150 liters of water to produce a single cup of coffee. And that's crazy. Another example, almond milk, okay, which is something was made famous by Starbucks kind of about 5 to 10 years ago, and they recently stopped doing it. And one of the reasons they stopped doing it is because for 1 liter of almond milk, it takes 600 liters of water to produce that 1 liter of almond milk. And what happens was the Starbucks, the Coffee Beans, the Costa Coffees of the world realized that, hey, it's just crazy. We can't be seen as a company that is selling almond milk that is just not sustainable, that is being used so fast, and that is going through this ridiculous life cycle and is using so much natural resources that, you know, how can we be pictured as that? And Starbucks took it off the menu. And if you go to most coffee shops these days, they're very reluctant to use almond milk because of the sustainability and carbon footprint that it leaves. So those are some really, really good examples, right? And on the whole, I would say roughly statistics, between 30 to 40% of the world's water, so the water that is produced, is actually used to produce food. It's not used for other types of irrigation. It's not used for energy. It's not used for other things. 30% is used for food. So you can see that your whole food picture has suddenly completely changed. And it's not just about the ingredients per se. It's about what goes into it. It's about the resources. It's about how that's optimized. It's about how far the food has traveled. It's incredible. And maybe the last point about health considerations is probably the only point that we actually really care about that much. We only think about these days about whether, are we eating healthy? Is there a reasonable amount and not too much sugar in our diet? Is this food going to help me combat heart disease? Those type of things. And maybe now we should start including all those other factors when we think about food and the choices that we're making. So what do I mean when I say something is sustainable? Very much like, for those of you who tuned into the circular economy talk a few weeks ago, it's very similar. You know, what is regeneratable? Okay, what can be put back into the soil? What can be protected and increase biodiversity and protect our local environments? You know, what has an ecological mandate that means that it doesn't just have a very short lifespan? What is fair and affordable? What is not doing damage to the planet? And all of those components add up to this kind of phrase of sustainability. And as a community, we need to have a set of moral principles and values that ensure that even though we may not achieve it every time, we are trying to make our lifestyle and our food lifestyle as sustainable as possible. So think about the idea of regeneration. You know, those of you who have kids, you always try to kind of regenerate your clothes. You know, you try to pass down your clothes from one kid to another just in an attempt to save cost, or maybe because you like it. There's a link between the children. For those of you who are trying to save plastics at the moment, maybe you're recycling plastics more. So think of it in those terms and try to bring in this kind of sustainability mindset when you have your food. And it doesn't need to dominate your mindset. It doesn't need to be something that you think about for every single meal, but it's definitely something that is helpful when trying to tackle the bigger issue of, you know, in 2050, will there be enough food out there? Quite a complex side, but let's try to break it down simply. From an agriculture perspective, you know, I think a lot of us just have this assumption that there is endless meat and plants out there. And that's not the case. And maybe this is the problem with the media and the problem with people not sending the right messages out there. But, you know, we need to find a way of either maintaining or increasing the output of agriculture, the agricultural output towards 2050, but not at the cost of the wider planet. So how do we look at that? We think about the future of food production. Are we going to look at things like plant-based alternatives, cultured food, things like that? Are we actually maximizing the land mass that we have in the world to produce the food that we have? And a really good example of this is, say, the Netherlands, where, you know, globally, about 40% of the land is actually farmland. So what does that mean? It means it's land that is being used to produce some form of food output. But in the Netherlands, what they're trying to do is they're trying to increase that number. So they're trying to actually say, well, are we maximizing the land that we have? So maybe instead of producing kind of 10 cows or 10, you know, 10 chickens in that particular piece of land, how do we maximize that land and that soil to produce as many chickens as possible? Obviously not to the detriment of the animal, but to actually maximize the output that we get at the end. So think about agriculture in those aspects, and some of the important aspects, I'd say, you know, to achieving a sustainable agriculture environment are things like crop rotation. Okay, think of ways of actually managing your crop rotation strategy to maximize your output. Use biological pesticides instead of man-made pesticides. Think of ways of soil conservation. So instead of just growing one crop in that soil, potentially, which is a monocropping type of strategy, potentially do multiple crops. Okay, so maybe you can do corn, rice, and different things using the same crops. And obviously they're going to be treated in different ways, but that will help you maximize the sustainability of the agricultural output that you're trying to do. Some other factors, is what you're doing economically viable? So I think there's always, you know, a lot of the people in the industry will come back and say, well, the costs are so high to do certain things that are generally sustainable. That's why we don't do them. But now with the advent of technology, and we're going to talk about technology a bit more later, there's so many mediums and mechanisms that we can use to actually make things cheaper. You know, there's drones now that can control climates within greenhouses, for instance. You know, I recently went to a greenhouse where I saw small micro drones that are getting rid of all the bees and the moths within greenhouses so that they don't eat the plants. So the technology is currently developing at such a rate that sustainable agriculture is actually really, really, well, not easy, but easier to do than it was in the last, you know, 50 to 100, 2,000 years. And one thing that's really important to grasp in this whole thing is to get to 2050, what we need to do in the next 20, 30 years, we need to make as much food in that 30-year period as we have done in the past 8,000 years. And the way we're going to do that is to integrate technology in the most optimal and environmentally enhancing way. So I think those are some of the things we really need to think about from a sustainable agriculture point of view. And when you guys go to farms, or when you guys think about the food that's going into your mouth, or that's, you know, going to be prepared for the food for your family, think about, has it gone through a sustainable means? You know, am I eating perennial food? Am I eating food that has had as minimal lifespan as possible in terms of production, minimal food, lifestyle production, life cycle? And think about it from a point of view, well, am I getting as natural and organic food as possible? And if you look at something like cereal, which a lot of us eat on a day-to-day basis, has it gone through the most organic, natural life cycle to optimize sustainable farming? Probably not. It definitely hasn't. So think about more natural, organic alternatives. And I think that will hold us in good stead going forward. This is really, really interesting from an environmental perspective. So just now we talked a lot about, you know, farming. This slide tends to deal with things more from an environment point of view. And I want to illustrate the codependencies of food, water, and energy. And this is really important because the three don't live without each other. You can't have food without water. You can't have food without energy. You can't have energy without food. you can't have water without the other two. It's just not sustainable. And it's one of these vicious cycles that exists out there. And as the world has gotten kind of bigger and richer, we have really failed to understand the link between those three, and really failed to understand how we can propagate our movement going forward in terms of how do we create an environment that actually maximizes food output, maximizes energy, and not to the detriment of water. And this is really interesting. So if you look at the table, it's quite scary, actually. And what it essentially does is try to give you a picture, if you to think of it simply, how much does the production of something contribute to the detriment of the environment? So if I were to produce prawns, farmed prawns, what is the impact that has on the environment? 26.9 kilojoules, right? Which is essentially the term used to dictate whether carbon dioxide is going into the atmosphere. So it has a pretty strong climate change impact, right? And we don't think about that. When I ate my, I don't know, prawn salad or whatever it is I had recently, I don't necessarily think about where those farmed prawns contributing to some kind of climate crisis. And if you go up the ladder, you can see, right? You've got beef, you've got mutton, you go down, you've got more fruits and veg, and it gives you an idea of really how food plays a quite an important role in the climate stakes. And that's not to say, oh, we just need to stop eating beef and we need to remove it. But maybe we should start thinking about how that beef is produced and the amount of energy, water resources, the amount of traditional energy that is going into producing those cows. And maybe there could be solutions to that. And there definitely are solutions to that. And some of the leading countries in the world are saying, well, let's start measuring our CO2 output in terms of ozone versus the food we're producing. And the United Nations have led this initiative for a number of years now, and it hasn't really got that far because we haven't put, we've always thought of them as mutually exclusive. We've always thought it's food here, environment here, and kind of other things like energy here. But now we need to start bringing them together and think of them as a complete picture. And as you can see, for those of you who may be vegetarians, you can see that your contribution is probably slightly greater to the reduction of CO2 levels and the reduction of climate change. But definitely we're all in a position where we can do better in understanding that output. And definitely for those of you in the tech sector, there can be some elements or development that you guys can help do or sponsor or even just be interested in that could help that. So always think about the environmental impacts of what's going into your body. I like this slide. It's, to me, a very good kind of illustration of what actually happens when before and after food has gone into your body. Okay, so we're obviously the consumption part, right? And we're doing a reasonably good thing, I think, in most countries of trying to eat little processed food, organic food. There's a lot more vegetarians and vegans out there. So it seems like we're okay on the consumption side. We've got enough marketing and enough of us are trying to alter our diets to make the food sustainability cycle a bit more optimized. What happens before that and what happens after that? Well, the food needs to be produced. But are we producing organic food? Are we producing free-range, animal cruelty-free food? So think about that. Think about the production process that goes into your food. And one of the interesting things when you go to the shop is you can actually now have much more visibility on the production because it's in the label. And I'm not saying go to the shop and read every label that's out there, but definitely for those of you who are conscious about your footprint when it comes to food on the environment, think about how it's being produced. Is it organic? Was it produced in a local field or a local greenhouse, so the traveling time was less? Things like that. Then move on to farm work. Farm work essentially means, well, what is the human impact on the food be? You know, is this food being produced in areas and ecosystems where people are suffering, where they've got poor working conditions, where they don't have access to fresh water or food themselves? So there's a footprint there as well. You know, are we in socially and environmentally working in as moral and optimized way as we can be? And I'm sure loads of you have seen lots of documentaries or film on this where a lot of the food in this world is produced in maybe the low economic areas of the world as well. So those areas where, you know, livable wages are very low, or that people don't have livable wages in some cases. There are no real fair trade rules. So think about that. And again, the visibility on that is becoming more and more paramount. I mean, it doesn't go 6 months before you hear another story about some product that we like that was produced in, a bad environment, or an environment that was not fair or habitable, and the people producing that were not treated well. So think about that. Processing and distribution, again, goes back to my previous point, is the packaging and shipping and everything responsible to the distribution of a product. Is it as minimal and as environmentally friendly as possible? Is it using recycled goods? Are we limiting the amount of packaging? A good example of this is some of these food apps that you have now, such as Uber Food or Uber Eats and Grab Food, where they give you the option to have no cutlery. And some restaurants on Grab and Uber are often now advertising themselves as sustainable restaurants, sustainable food-friendly restaurants. They give you packaging that is recycled. They give you packaging that can be used again. They often give you cups and holders that invite you to use it again in your own surroundings with your kids, etc. So think about your processing and distribution, and is that also being done in as optimal way to promote food sustainability? And then we've obviously got waste. So what actually happens? What actually happens after our food? I mentioned just now briefly that a third of all landfill is essentially food that's kind of been thrown away. But do we have a real strong concept of waste? In Western countries, there was a big push maybe 20 years ago to recycle properly. So you recycle fresh food, you recycle your plastics, you recycle other types of food in different compartments. And I've seen in Asia that's getting a bit of traction now. But is it going as far as it should go? And are people using it in as optimal a way as possible? And one of the really good examples I give people when I talk about food wastage and consumption is think about your fridge. A fridge, which is one of the most energy consuming devices in your house, there is a science, there is a technique to use your fridge in an optimal way that A, gets your food to last longer, B, is as environmentally friendly by not using as much oxygen as possible, and C, actually helps you have a more healthy lifestyle. So the use of Tupperware is a good example, right? People like to think Tupperware is one of those products that is just reserved for, middle-aged women who like to go and just buy loads and things like that. No, there's an actual science behind Tupperware, and it actually causes food to be packaged and last longer. The way you order your fridge, the reason there are different compartments in different ways, you've got the trays at the bottom, you've got the fan at the top, it's done in a way that is actually encouraging you to put things in your fridge in an organized fashion. And one of the most interesting classes I ever went, which I went by accident, was someone actually helping me organize my fridge. And it was quite brutal, because I'm one of those people who traditionally just chucks everything in the fridge. And I don't necessarily put my fruits and my vegetables separately. I don't necessarily put my milk in one compartment and my eggs in another compartment. I just kind of throw everything in there. And this lesson actually taught me quite an eloquent way that actually, just by organizing my fridge, I could actually contribute really effectively to the life cycle of that product by, just giving it longer duration, increase the expiry. And also just by not using the fridge as much. I'm not always going in there searching for stuff. I'm not always opening it and having to filter through many things. It was just a practical exercise. And it's really interesting. And that's why next time you go and buy a fridge, look if that fridge is actually contributing to a more sustainable energy output and sustainable food life cycle. And now you see these big stickers on the front of the fridge that says, this is my energy intake, this is my energy outtake. These aren't just there for the sake of it. A lot of it's marketing, but a lot of it's actually science that says, well, this is the fridge that actually does the best or most for the environment. Another example of waste, and another example from my childhood, when I grew up, we were taught to compost a lot. And that was mainly because of the school I went to. We were just taught, instead of just throwing food in the rubbish bin, think about composting. Composting leads to other things like fertilization and things like that. And in Asia now, I think that's getting a bit more traction. Are we utilizing our food post-eating in as sophisticated a fashion that can help other things like soil, that can help growing other herbs and other vegetables or whatever, and not necessarily just contributing to that landfill problem that we had elsewhere? So think about those type of things. And hopefully now you can see the whole life cycle. And next time, maybe you're picking up, I don't know, a salad or a piece of meat at the supermarket, you might just trigger thoughts it might just trigger thoughts in you that say, hey, how was this produced? Is it distributed or processed in the most optimal way? And any little helps in this fight. And I think in the long term, when you think about 2050 again, which is this big milestone, are we giving ourselves enough of a chance in 2050 just by thinking about really simple, rudimentary things that kind of make up our life now, right? So think about those things. The other thing which is really interesting, I talked about the psychology of food. The other thing that's really interesting that's happened over the last 25 years is this idea of how much are we actually eating? So I don't know about you guys, but I on the whole, I'm surrounded by even random members of the public where I stay and stuff. I'm surrounded by people that overeat. And these are people that don't necessarily need that amount of food. It's just kind of greed. It's like I go to a restaurant, I order 5 dishes instead of ordering 2, even though I know I'm only probably going to finish two dishes. And yeah, not everyone is the same, and maybe you want to sample things, but think about the net effect of you sampling 5 different types of food. Think about the ecosystem of there being other people out there that don't necessarily have food. Think about how smaller portions are actually more healthier for you. And I think a lot of restaurants are moving in that trend as well. And it's a very big difference between Western and Eastern culture at the moment, where Western culture is actually very orientated towards small, so-called healthy sizes. I mean, obviously you see exceptions to this from McDonald's in America and things like that. But on the whole, they're moving in that direction. But in Asia, especially when there's a sharing type of food culture, we still have kind of big portions. And maybe we need to start asking ourselves, do we need that? Are we eating the optimal amount of food? Because if we're eating too much, if we're overeating or over ordering, well, overeating is not good for you from a health point of view, and over ordering leads to mass wastage. So think about those type of things. And this slide, I'll let you guys read it yourself, deals with a lot of the individual ways that you guys within your businesses and as individuals can probably help push this agenda forward without too much cost, without too much effort, and without too much kind of mental health kind of wasted on this. And it's about becoming more humanitarian, and it's about thinking about developing the parts of the world which are creating these foods for us, but maybe are not actually benefiting from those foods. So places where there's water shortage, a third of the world currently, at least 1 in 9 people in the world currently doesn't have access to fresh food or water. Now, that's quite a scary stat. So from a humanitarian perspective, we need to start making that more visible, and we need to start doing that. So maybe charity contribution, or the contributions from a corporate CSR perspective, are you channeling that in the right way? Instead of maybe building the next tall building, we should be challenging our resources that way. Ensuring that food supply chains are done at the lowest cost possible and with timelines restricted is a really good example. Scaling up climate resilience across food system. What does that mean? Is understanding, back to the slide we had earlier, what is our output? What is our carbon footprint in creating a lot of food that we're eating? And how can technology and just education within society actually improve that process? Strengthening resilience, I think we talked about earlier. And one of the things I would really ask you guys to think about, I guess, after this and when you've got time, is globally, how equal are we from a food perspective? I just mentioned that 1 in 9 people pretty much doesn't have access to, or is malnourished and doesn't have access to the right amount of food and water. Well, why is that so? And am I thinking about that? And am I doing enough to not over order in my own culture, in my own system, so that maybe that food can be redirected elsewhere? Am I contributing from a charitable perspective so that those underdeveloped or undernourished places are actually being supported? And don't make this mistake of thinking that, well, we all live in pockets of isolation. Well, it's really good to think that we live in pockets of isolation for the bad things, and then for the good things that we're all sharing them. But that's not really how it works. We need to focus on the bad things. And the way to do that is by sharing and understanding and contributing to that process in a really, really positive way. So don't necessarily go out of your way and think of it as a big world-changing thing that you need to do, but definitely think about things from a perspective, well, I'm benefiting, are others benefiting as well? And one way of doing that, which is a really easier way of doing that, is consumer behavior, right? Challenging your own consumer behavior, changing the way people are. You know, if you're in a restaurant and you see people wasting food, it's not the easiest conversation to have with people, but potentially you could just say to them, and I've seen this done a couple of times, where someone has come and said, well, if you're not going to eat that, do you mind if I just take that with me or give it to the homeless or whatever the end result is? But changing that consumer behavior is really, really important, because if we keep doing things the way we're doing, fine, we may be okay, but our next generations may not be okay. And as more people come into the world, the people in less fortunate situations, probably their problem gets exacerbated. The people in the most fortunate situations, their situation just gets better. And you're creating this huge gulf and gap between the two. That's going to be easier to solve now than it is later in the future. So think about how your consumer behavior can actually help the bigger issue. And one way I would always say to people to do this is just be healthier. You know, being healthy has a knock-on effect, not only internally within you, but externally with the environment and ecologically, that is really hard to picture, but is undoubtedly there. And if there are ways of drilling messages like, you know, you eating in a more healthy way actually helps or reduces the extent of climate change, then go about and do that. If it shows you that you're eating healthier actually promotes biodiversity and soil nutrition and things like that, then go and do that. And it's a happy balance, because you need to find what's good for what's right for you, but you also need to find what's right in terms of your commitment to the wider world and the environment. So think about those things, and I think we can channel our way forward. And I just mentioned it, and the last slide kind of deals with this quite clearly, if you like. You know, how many people out there are actually in the position that we're in? I don't think, I think all of us have this assumption that there is a natural access to food, easy access to food and easy access to water. But when I tell you that there could potentially be 800 million people out there who are facing hunger at this very point in time, and then I'm telling you at the same time that, well, we're wasting nearly 50% of the food produced in the world, doesn't really add up. And it doesn't add up because we're not combining those two statistics. We're not finding ways of not wasting food or creating too much food and giving it to the poor people. We're just treating them as silos. And I think that's a big problem. And some of the bigger, better countries in the world at food sustainability are doing really good jobs at this. And you look at countries like, one of the biggest pioneers in this field is the Netherlands. They're creating pockets of change, whether it's through greenhouses and designing mass production of food on a low cost but environmentally friendly scale. They're doing it in such a positive way that I think other countries can learn from that. Another good example is what Singapore is doing with plant-based food, which is essentially challenging the idea that, you know, we may not have enough meat in the world for us in, say, 20 to 30 years time. So how do we replicate that? How do we slightly acclimatize ourselves to consumer behavior, people who like meat, but we do it in a more eco-friendly and more positive, cheaper way as well. So you'll see in Singapore there's a lot more plant-based diets, there's a lot more plant-based consumer behavior as well, which I think is really important. And the reason why nutrition and food security is important is because it doesn't really matter. This isn't an existential risk in the sense that, you know, if we don't solve this problem, the whole world is going to die. What's going to happen is you're just going to create a bigger gap between the people who have the means of surviving versus the people who don't have the means of surviving. And all of us travel enough and have enough visibility through the internet and digitalization to see that that's not a world that we necessarily want to live in. We can't live in that world. It's just not fair. It's not necessarily optimal for the growth of humanity. And it's also probably really stupid in the long run, because you're actually not maximizing the land space, the natural resources, and everything else in an optimal fashion. So think about food and nutrition security in a way that we're trying to equalize the playing field for everyone. And I think that's really important. And for those of you in the tech arena, there's loads of things that you can do going forward. You can start, you know, orientating some of your development to equality and sustainability. So try to find means of reducing production life cycles. Try to find ways of introducing your tech or your intellectual capital in your local community to ensure that, you know, from farm to table processes are in place. So maybe we don't need to get all our corn from the Netherlands or our carrots from Italy. maybe we get them all from the location we're in. And you've got a farm to table type policy in place. You feel happy about it because you're contributing to the local community. And more often than not, it's healthier and better for you because the food has not gone through that huge production life cycle that we automatically are kind of ingrained in now. So I think those are some of the things that we kind of really need to think about. And now, just before I kind of go on to any questions, I wanted to talk to you. I mean, a lot of you will say, well, the easiest, and the media does a really good job of portraying this, in a horrible way, but they do a good job of pulling your heartstrings. They say the easiest way of doing this is to just not eat meat. And I know, I'm sure there's a couple of vegetarians on the talk. That's not entirely correct. Okay, having moderate meat consumption is definitely helpful to, reducing the carbon footprint that's out there. And obviously, if you don't eat meat, you're obviously saving the lives of an animal, and your animal welfare doesn't become an issue. But you don't necessarily need to give up meat to be one of these big players in this arena. And it's just about thinking about, well, where has that meat come from? How has that cow or that chicken or that pig been fed? Is it using kind of man-made type solutions, or is it using more organic, natural type solutions? And we all like corn-fed chicken, for instance, and we look at those type of things when we go out to buy our meat produce. So from a meat perspective, there are ways you can kind of rethink about things without necessarily giving up meat. And also just think about, well, are you eating meat for the right reasons? And this is really important, because if you do what Singapore is doing and kind of going towards what kind of more cultured meat and plant-based meat, well, are you eating meat for the taste, or because you actually like the idea that you've killed an animal and are eating the animal? Well, I presume most of us are doing it for the taste. So if the taste can be replicated one for one through non-meat ways, like plant, then why not go down that route? And I think generally from a health perspective, it would be sensible to say a balanced diet is beneficial for both you and the environment. Don't overload on one and underload on the other, right? And so as an omnivore, you also can play a big role in that. And the role isn't just become a vegetarian. It's about understanding plant-based protein. It's about understanding where your food is being wasted. Is there fair trade associated with your food? And your food is actually more friendly, environmentally friendly. So don't just necessarily think it's binary that you have to be vegetarian or you're kind of committing some kind of crimes against the environment. So I think those are some of the important points. Now, just before I take any questions, if there are any, what I will say is, think about food, not just in the context of what you're eating, but how you're treating the food after you've eaten it, and also where that food came from. So it's thinking about that whole life cycle that we went through. I think that's really, really important. I think it'll also help you from a logical standpoint to process things in a different way. When we're doing a project at work, whether it's in finance or insurance or marketing, we try to make those projects as logical and as linear to a target as much as possible. And understanding food is somewhat like that. It's a start, a finish, what happens at the start, what's going to happen at the finish, and all the steps in between. And for me, I never really thought about food in the way I've described today, probably until maybe the last 5-6 years. But what it helped me do is to realize that there is a system and a process going on. And with all such systems and processes, they can be optimized and automated. And I'm working with a lot of guys in the tech space now who are looking at optimizing the food production process. Like I mentioned, through drones, which control climates, through drones that kill moths, through soil nutrient robots that literally go and churn and rotate crops, things like that. And a really good movie to watch on this, if you haven't seen it, is Interstellar. Well, you don't have to watch the whole movie, but if you look at Interstellar, the first 15 or 20 minutes is all about a world where essentially food is not sustainable. And the only thing they have left is corn. And after that, the world is all going to go to hell. And that's why they're looking for other planets to live on. And if you want a utopian kind of picture of what it's going to be like, I'd watch that movie. Sorry, a dystopian picture of what it looks like. I'd watch that movie and see the impact that you could potentially have in 20, 30 years if you don't make the changes today, right? So think about food in that type of context. I think that'd be really helpful. Like I said, this is not a preachy session where I want all of you to go outside and, start recycling immediately and start, cutting down your portions. it's very much done on an individual basis. And as individuals, you have the right to choose how much you contribute to those social economic processes. But think also about, what's going on in the future with your kids, your grandkids, your great grandkids, and what type of planet we're leaving them with. And we're at a stage now where technologically we're at a precipice where we can make as much change as possible. And I think we should do as much as possible. And if we win that battle, great. If we don't win that battle, at least we've tried. And for those of you looking for inspiration, I think Singapore is a really good place for that. I think the work that Singapore is doing on plant-based proteins in particular is fantastic. For those looking for kind of more traditional influences or motivations, look at the Netherlands. I mean, they're just doing an absolutely fantastic job. I think their work on food sustainability is just unparalleled at the moment. The way they're creating greenhouses, which are optimizing food processes, which are pretty much exporting most of certain vegetables and certain food produce in the world at the moment. And they've done it in a way that is not culturally sensitive, but is very, very optimistic and very orientated towards helping the wider community. And tying this back to the circular economy discussion we had a few weeks ago, if you can find kind of a symbiosis between the two where food sustainability also helps your circular economy, right, then I think we have a win-win situation. So those are just some takeaways from today. I hope you enjoyed today's session. I think it was great. And for those of you who have any questions, please go ahead now. Let's see, what do we have? Okay, so we have one question from the startup community. Hi, Rish. Do you personally have a good relationship with food? How is your relationship with food like? So I've gone through kind of peaks and troughs. And I think when I was in the UK, where I'm from, I was encouraged and ate in a way that was more environmentally friendly. So I thought about a lot of the things that I've discussed today. I thought about wasting food. We were really encouraged not to waste food at school and at home. And we were really thought about recycling and composting and things like that I mentioned. And when I came to Asia, and obviously this is generalization and applicable to me, but the Asian food landscape is so dramatically different to the Western food landscape that I automatically just naturally didn't care about food in that way. And my relationship with food became much more indulgent. I didn't necessarily think about, the plate of noodles that I order at the hawker store, and if I couldn't finish it, where that's going to go. I didn't necessarily think about the produce that was going into my food as much because it just wasn't in my face as much. In the UK, it was very much in my face. And so I think I went through a trough when I was in Asia, just becoming overindulgent and maybe not thinking about that whole life cycle and end-to-end process going into my relationship with food. And what happened, I guess, about 3 to 4 years ago, I started to think, well, you know what, there's a difference between really, really enjoying food, but also over enjoying food to the extent of other things. And when you travel and you see different communities and you see people suffering and people enjoying, and people without water and people with too much water, it starts to make you think in different ways. And for those of you who enjoy traveling and getting out there, it's one of the things that you will learn on your exploration, that actually different communities relate to food in different ways. And when I went through that journey, I started to kind of rationalize about how I think about food. And whilst I by no means profess to be the most healthy eater or the most I'm not the type of person who necessarily grows my own crops and things like that in entirety. I do try to push as much forward as possible. And it's about a slow transition for me, right? It's not just about necessarily acting. It's also about having those conversations with your kids or your family or your friends to ensure that you're talking about these things, because the best way of getting traction is word of mouth. And getting word of mouth is important so that people understand that you have a different view and you're tackling this problem in this way, and it just gets people thinking. And I think that's kind of what I've done with food. And my relationship with food at the moment is really, really good. I definitely have started looking more at the packaging on the food that I buy, seeing where that food has come from. I try to buy a lot more locally than I ever did in my life. And the reason behind that is primarily to help the SMEs and the local farmers in their pursuit for a sustainable business. And that's really important to me because, if you've chosen to live in a space, you want to optimize and have that space be as optimal as possible for you. And helping the local farmers is a really big part of that. So I think that kind of explains to you a bit about my relationship with food. By the way, I would never be a vegetarian, so I'm not going to have that type of discussion. But yeah, it's just not something I can do. I like meat, but I've also tried to find ways of, articulating and understanding my meat thought process better. So if I could eat plant-based protein and it kind of tastes the same as what I'm eating from a natural meat perspective, then great, I'll do that. Do you think those who practice sustainable diet are people who truly care about the earth? Well, this is a bit of a loaded question because I can't assume or presume, that people who practice sustainable diets are just doing it for the sake of doing it. I think that would just be horribly wrong. I think there's a couple of things to talk about here. One is, whenever you practice anything, whether it's a sustainable diet or exercise or religion or whatever, you need to understand the rationale of why you're practicing it. Like, I don't expect any of you on the call to suddenly practice sustainable eating or food policy effectiveness because Rish has told you to do so. That just wouldn't be right. It should be something that you respect and truly believe in, right? And sometimes it's not for you. I mean, I know some of my closest confidant and friends, family, are people who just can't have sustainable diets, or choose not to have sustainable diets, or choose to see food in a sustainable way. It's just not the way they're built. It's not the way their mind process works. And I was like that for a pretty long period of my lifetime, where you just kind of think, well, what's the point? It's a bit of a selfish thought, but it's similar to, like, you enjoying a can of Coke, or maybe you just kind of jumping in a swimming pool, whatever. It gives you a certain amount of excitement, and who am I to challenge that? But I do think one of the important things we need to deal with is working as a society on every type of issue, whether it's poverty, whether it's food, whether it's COVID, whether it's any of those things. And if you start working on ideas from a social standpoint, then food is a part of that. And if you can contribute to a sustainable food life cycle with minimal effort from you, then why not? It doesn't take much money, if at all, it doesn't take much effort, if at all, right? So why not contribute to that? And I think one of the biggest problems is the way, and you see this with climate change, and there was recently the big climate change conference that was going, the global climate conference that was going on. And I did look at that conference and I thought to myself, well, do these people really care about climate change? I mean, really, do they? Are they just not talking about it because it's a fad? Are they not just talking about it because it's the in thing to do because we have to talk about it? Well, I did think that at times. And you can only judge that based on the output at the end of it and the acts, right? And if people are acting in a way that is creating to some level of sustainable lifestyle or climate change, reduction of climate change, then that's it. That's what you judge them on. So, I don't think it's a question about whether you truly care about the earth or not. I think it's more a question about, what do you think your moral responsibility is, and whether you think you can, carry out that moral responsibility with as minimal effort and as minimal disruption to your own lifestyle. And obviously those are playing, those are different levels for every person. So you just need to come up with a happy balance on your lifestyle. Yeah, there's an interesting comment about overeating. I think the overeating thing it's really interesting, okay? Because one of the reasons people overeat is because they don't want to waste food, okay? So they see a big plate in front of them and they don't want to waste food, which is endearing because it's obviously leading to a reduced food wastage, but it's also unhealthy for you. But people don't think about things in other ways. So, where I come from in the UK, it's not very common. Well, even in some countries I lived in Asia as well, it's not very common to go to a restaurant, order too much, and then at the end of the meal, say, oh, I'd like to take away the remainder in a box, okay? In England in particular, people just don't do that often because maybe it seems like they're stingy, maybe it seems like, it makes them look bad because it looks like you're going to have the same food tomorrow, whatever reason that might be. And that's interesting to me because why wouldn't you just go and take away that food? Because, A, you're not wasting, B, you have food for tomorrow, so you probably save some money tomorrow, and C, you know you're doing something for the greater good, right? So the idea of over ordering, it's a bit of an indulgent thing, but maybe try to think about it from the perspectives of, well, I might be over ordering for that meal, but if I over order, well, maybe I can stretch it out to 3 meals. And I think that's a really different way, my different take on looking about over ordering. And I have a tendency to over order, but I have a tendency to eat a lot as well. So I kind of get away with it. There's a small part of our team who are focusing on sustainable diets. Being in Australia makes it easier for us. We have great farms here and berries pickings for children. Do you remember to mention, so yes, I think places like Australia are quite good, a bit like the Netherlands, where it's advertised a bit more. And for those of you who are not in those type of countries, those of you who are maybe in the Malaysias, the Vietnams, the Hong Kongs of the world, where people don't talk about sustainable diets and sustainable foods in it's not in your face, maybe try to promote the conversation. And it's one of the best things happening in schools at the moment, where schools are starting to educate children on things like sustainability and food usage. Because think about it, if you learn it at the age of 3, 4, 5 years old, you're probably going to carry that out for the rest of your life. A bit like 1, 2, 3 ABC, right? And I think that's a really important balance. And I work with a lot of schools, and one of their biggest agendas is the food agenda. Promoting healthy lifestyles, yes, but also reducing wastage of food and showing children how food is actually produced, where it comes from, where is it going. And you guys can do that. Don't need to do that in education arenas. You can do that in the comfort of your own home, talking to your nephews, your nieces, your kids, your grandparents, whoever. And I think that will be a big part of it. And for those of you in Melbourne or other countries that are doing a good job of it, well, talk to your friends in other parts of the world and extend the message. Thanks so much. I really appreciate today's session. It's one of the final ones of the kind of environment sessions that we're doing, the sustainability sessions. If any of you have got any questions, you've got my contact details in front of you. So please reach out to us for that. As mentioned by Anna, there's going to be a short poll at the end of this. So please do that. The